at the start, and then work my way around with some of the questions that I shared with you. Obviously, during the course of it, if there's something that crosses your mind that you think is worth sharing, do feel free to intervene and add a point or whatever. I'm going to try and obviously keep it moving, but if feel free to intervene. We'll get questions coming up, and towards the latter half of the webinar, I'll be pulling in some of those to ask you. And again, if it may be directed at one or two of you, but if you want to add in thoughts, that's fine. Is Claire appearing? Okay, let's whip that out. Very good. Excellent.
So run CNN and Bloomberg next, is it for you?
I don't know about that. You certainly get an appreciation for the interviewing approach. My goodness, it's you've got, and I don't have a little earpiece here with somebody talking in my head at the same time, which would be even more distracting. I don't know how they do it. But,
so you're promising not to skewer any of us, are you?
I know. I'll stick to the questions. Unless there's kind of pregnant pauses and I have a few little torpedoes, then I can pull out. But yeah, no, it's.
So I can see 7 boxes on the screen, Ronan. Is that intended?
No, 7 boxes.
Yeah, there's 2 that just say Timony Leadership Institute, and they've 3 arrows, red, green, blue, and green. I don't know if anyone else can see that.
I can, yeah.
Okay, if you go to
Claire McNamara in the middle, as well as the 4 of us.
Okay, that shouldn't be the case.
Sorry, Paul, is that on the side of your screen, on the right-hand side?
No, it's right in the middle.
Well, yeah, but for me, it's on the right-hand side. It starts with me on the left, Sean, then Ronan. Paul is on the main screen now because he's talking to us, and then you have Claire and the 2 things with the arrows.
Okay.
So mine is set up to show all the speakers in equal-sized boxes, depending on the number of speakers, of course. But at the moment, I'm seeing 7 equal-sized boxes.
Okay, should.
And I see 5.
Sure.
And it says 7 participants underneath.
Okay. Let's just see, can we get rid of those?
It's down to 6 now.
Down to 6. And in the corner, do you have it on gallery view or speaker view? Or how does it? Up on the top?
Basically, I've got 6 boxes now, rectangular boxes. Okay. Looking at the list of participants, if you look at the list of participants, it's showing a Timony Leadership Institute as host and a Timony Leadership Institute as co-host, and yourself, Ronan, as co-host.
Yeah.
So all those 3 Timony boxes, including yourself, are showing up on my screen, which may be the view that goes out then to anyone watching. I don't know.
Ronan, am I appearing for you with the Timony logo?
No, I just see the 4.
You are.
Moment.
Yeah. For us,
you are for us. Yeah.
Yeah. Alison, when you speak, when you speak there, you're there on one of the Timony logos.
Okay.
Okay. Right. Let's just have a quick look at streaming on YouTube.
Will I broadcast, Ronan?
Just let me check what it looks like on YouTube here. Yeah, it's okay. So you can broadcast.
Okay. Okay, perfect.
Sorry, one moment. One moment.
You just tell me when, Ronan, and I'll.
Okay, go.
Okay, ready? Okay, good luck, everyone.
Okay.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our weekly Timony webinar on leadership in turbulent times. Our purpose of these webinars is to support you in your leadership role as you face the current challenges, and importantly, as we work towards getting back and in an uncertain future, of course. Just to remind you, there's a questions and answers box on your screen at the bottom, I think. If you have any question that you'd like to put to the panel, please enter it there, and we will try to get to it over the course of the webinar. You should be able to see other people's questions as well. So if you fiddle around in that, you'll explore the options there. There's also a chat facility on the screen. So if you want to introduce yourself and chat with others on the discussion, feel free to do that. So while this tiny hidden protein, the coronavirus, has impacted every walk of life, our panel of alumni leaders this afternoon are coming from different sectors, from the world of finance, communications, and education. I'm very grateful to each of you for taking the time out to join us this afternoon and share your experiences and insights with us. There's about 50 people so far listening in. So first of all, just to introduce, we have Sean O'Flanagan, who did the first Timony ALP in 2013 and is Chief Investment Officer of Kinsale Capital Management, based here in Dublin, an investment management boutique which advises business owners, global families, and pension funds on long-term investments, and is best known for two award-winning funds, the Kinsale Compass Fund and Kinsale Navigator Fund. So looking forward to exploring with you, Sean, some of the economic implications of all this. And then moving west to Professor Paul O'Doherty, who is Deputy President and Registrar of National University of Ireland in Galway, and he has overall responsibility for the academic operations of the university, but also has a range of other responsibilities and positions of leadership inside and outside of the university as well. Paul is a German scholar and, among other areas, has worked on the legacy of the Holocaust, German involvement in Celtic studies, and more recently on Jews in Irish literature and history. And Paul did the Advanced Leadership Program in 2018. And then finally, Peter Finnegan, who is an expert in the area of crisis communication, which we're all getting more familiar with at the moment, and also persuasive communication, media communication, and indeed communication of change. He acts as an advisor and a strategist on a wide range of multinational companies, governmental organizations, and also leaders in individuals in leadership roles as well. And Peter did the Advanced Leadership Program in 2015. So maybe, Sean, if I could start with you. Clearly, we've all got a good grasp at this stage of how exceptional this pandemic is compared to others from a health point of view, but perhaps maybe less of an understanding of the economic tsunami that's heading our way, and the IMF labeled it the Great Lockdown. Could you maybe give us a bit of context for the current economic situation?
Okay, thank you, Ronan, and just delighted to share a few thoughts, and thank you to everyone who's joined us this morning. So what I'd like to do maybe is just put your question in maybe a bit of context and compare it perhaps to prior crises. And I think probably the first thing that comes to mind is just the immediacy of it, how volatile it's been, how unprecedented it's been. And I think to look back in history, if we look back even to the 1930s, to the great recession and depression of that time period, we've had the worst decline and the quickest decline in stock markets ever in the history of markets in the last month. So from mid-February to mid-March, the S&P 500, which is the index of the 500 largest global companies, was down over a third. Massive decimation of wealth. We also had the biggest one-day rally in history, followed by the second one-day biggest loss in history. So just enormous, enormous volatility. And the reason for that really has been that this started, as we all know, as a supply side problem. Those of us who have businesses across the globe knew how difficult it was to get component parts from China and elsewhere. There were logistical backlogs, so there was supply issues in trying to get your goods manufactured. And that quickly then became a demand side problem when governments across Europe and elsewhere enforced what's called a lockdown. So in essence, what's occurred now is the government has put the economy into a coma, for want of a better phrase, and is providing life support to that economy by making payments to individuals and trying to alleviate debts of companies and banks. And maybe just to give another sense of history, just thinking back even to the financial crisis in 2008, there was a financial crisis, banks were impacted, construction firms were impacted, but there was no threat to life or limb in the broad sense. And even go back to World War II with Pearl Harbor, where there was a huge shock to the economic system. Prior to that, there was very little leverage in the system. So most companies had good balance sheets. They weren't very efficient. And what I mean by that is they had a lot of slack in their system. They were sourcing their parts locally. They had excess employees. There was very little debt. Whereas today, unfortunately, we're at a position whereby many, many companies focused on efficiency, on getting supplies delivered overnight, and having very leveraged balance sheets and really having no spare capacity. And the knock-on effect of that is that we're seeing it in terms of shortages of component parts, but also makes it very difficult to get back on your feet again if you're going to be relying on the government to help your consumer and then to help you pay for the employees and the team. So I hope that just gives a sense of where we're at and maybe how it differs from perhaps the financial crisis of 2008 and even the crises back in the 30s and the 40s.
You're on silent, Ronan.
Sorry, for a small open economy like us here in Ireland, what implications are there, do you think, for us?
Yeah, I think we all know, unfortunately, they're pretty huge. Now, some of them for certain industries are very severe. Tourism, transport, leisure, arts, very, very difficult. But for others, not so much. And you can't help but thinking of, whether it's I suppose the software industry in the broader sense, or the medical device industry, where they're working flat out in companies in Galway and elsewhere. And even in the telecom sector, where there's a massive demand for cloud storage and data centers. So certain sectors will do just fine. Others will be hit very badly. But I think where support is most needed is for small SMEs, as they're known as small and medium enterprises, that just may not have the cash flow. If you don't have revenues coming in, it's very hard to meet your payroll. And then it's very hard for your customers to spend again. So some very challenging times for a lot of sectors, but some great opportunities as well, which we might touch on later on.
Later, very good. Yes, and well, Peter, if I could move to you, just given the unprecedented nature of this crisis, how do you think those in leadership have handled communications so far? Like, are we seeing best practice that we should take into account for handling future crises?
In a word, they've done a great job and are doing a great job. The key thing involved in when you've got a crisis, people are hungry for information when there's a crisis on. People want to know what's going on, why is it happening, what's going to happen in the future. And the fact that this government and the authorities in general have been so open, so clear in what they're communicating. I suppose really, if you're in any crisis, what you're trying to get across if you're the authority, is that you become the most credible source of information. There's an awful lot of rumor going on. Everybody thinks they know what's going on, but there has to be one central point which people can trust, that to be giving the best and most credible information. So for that to happen, they've got to, I suppose, really, there are three things they need. They need to be truthful, they need to be clear, they need to be accurate, and they need to be timely. And if you look at what's been happening since this thing began, we're actually spoiled in a way when you look at what's happening overseas, because we're actually getting that, and we're getting it very credibly. I think the reason that's happening as well is because it's led by the medical profession and not necessarily led by politicians, if you understand the information that we're getting. And we're getting this regular update from Tony Holohan, you know, and he has proved in this case to be really a rock of sense. And he only, when he got ill there for a while, I think the country nearly panicked when he got ill, because they were saying, "Geez, Tony, we need you very badly. Come back and talk to us." Because he's the person who has the knowledge. You trust him. There's no spin. He's not trying to make things good or trying to make things better than they look. In fact, one of the key things about what's happening here is that when things are going wrong, we've been very upfront about it. Mm-hmm. You know, when we had an issue with, for instance, with the protective gear coming over from China, we knew about it. Yeah. You know, when there was an issue in relation to finding the agents for testing, we knew about it. And even now, as you see, the thing that's emerging at the moment in relation to the homes, it's not so much that could be a cock up maybe from somebody else's perspective, but the communication of it is very clear. Mm. So I'd have to say that we're getting the big messages across. I think everybody in the country knows what's happening. Mm. And if you look, you only have to look to other jurisdictions to see what's going on. Maybe you look what's happening in Britain, where it's very, very defensive. When you look what's happening in the States, then what do you want to start thinking about? When you look at the way the president is trying to dominate those daily those daily briefings, from a purely political point of view, the only bright spark on the horizon in the States is the way that Andrew Cuomo is dealing with things in New York, exactly as it should be done, straight up, telling people exactly what's going on, not telling them it's any better than it is, telling them what to expect. So in terms of the clarity of what we're getting, the timeliness of what we're getting, the accuracy of what we're getting, I'd have to say, you know, they're doing an excellent job.
And do you think that as we move towards, let's say, returning to work, and there's going to be a lot of communication needed there, is there a learning there about involving experts as a leader?
No, absolutely. I mean, what's been proven in this case, like from a leadership perspective, we take, for instance, the government leadership, they've been led by the medics in this, and that's been clear, and they've taken to an extent of the big policy, and but they're in the background. The medics are actually leading, I suppose, what's going on and informing what's going on, and it's very clear. Yeah. So as it begins to open, right, we're going to have all sorts of expertise, and it's going to be very difficult, because I think that it's, in a way, it's easy enough to gradually close things down. I'm not so sure it's easy to gradually open them up again. Yeah. Because there's a whole pent up need to get back to work, to get back out into normality. And once we've actually turned the curve, people will begin to feel at that stage, even if there's not much of a curve, turn the plateau, if you want to call it that, people will begin to feel, okay, so I'm relieved now, let's get back. But don't forget that the journey, that the position that you're in on the way down was the same position that you were in on the way up. So there are still an awful lot of people out there who are going to be infected. There's still an awful lot of people, unfortunately, who are going to die. Mm-hmm. But once the valve is released, that's going to take a lot of expertise, and it's going to take an enormous amount of persuasion to hold people back, because I think that there's a real pent-up anxiety to get out there. Holding that back is not going to be easy.
Well, Paul, maybe if I could move to you, just there's been a bit of surprise, I'd say, and also a lot of praise for how universities such as your own have moved so quickly from a huge physical campus into a virtual campus for thousands of students over the space of a couple of weeks. Can you tell us just some of your experience in that move, and how it's worked out for you.
Sure. I think there are a couple of things were key. First of all, the alacrity with which our colleagues embraced the challenge. It was fairly sudden. On the 12th of March, there was an announcement that all educational institutions were closing at 6 p.m. that evening. Now, we were fortunate in this country, unlike, for example, Germany, where in that we had most of the semester done already. That Thursday was a Thursday of week 9 out of 12. But what we did was, and what we did here in Galway was, we very quickly said, okay, take the following week, we put a communication out the next day, take the next week, figure out how you're going to deliver the rest of the remaining 2 weeks semester, and let's start planning to get exams online, but give people choices. So a lot of our exams are being run online, but about 40% of the scheduled exams, 43%, decided to opt for alternative forms of assessment. Now, so far so good. The exam started yesterday, and there has been no news whatsoever about the running of the online exams, so that is good news. But it has presented its own challenges in that, if anything, this has reinforced the argument around a national broadband, because the hard reality is that whilst we encouraged Irish students to go home, some of them will be going home to areas where the broadband is limited, and that may well prove challenging for some of them in terms of doing online assessment. But the real speed and goodwill with which colleagues reacted, and the engagement with the students and the communication piece, to go back to Peter's point, was absolutely critical in all of that. And I have to say that we've certainly had a feeling here in Galway, and been getting reports here in Galway that we've had that level of engagement with the students, with our staff, that has enabled this to go. But look, there are massive challenges ahead, and I'll come back to those. But the communication and the goodwill of staff are absolutely critical in that.
Very good. Peter, maybe if I could go back to you just on that, on the communication piece. In the past few webinars, this has come up quite a bit about the importance of communicating clearly with employees and regularly. And I suppose quite a few of us are, could say we're zoomed out at this stage with with the number of meetings, if I can use that phrase. With a few more weeks of restriction to go, what can leaders be saying now? Should we keep up that frequency of communication? Should it be different? Any thoughts on that?
Certainly on the frequency is yes. I think that people obviously need to know what's going on. If you take that when you're in your own organization, there's lots of communication going on, even kind of communication that's not in a structured or formal sense going on all of the time, meeting people in corridors, meeting people, for coffee, meeting people for lunch or whatever. And you have your structured meetings as well. But I think that, because as you know, that communication is what holds organizations together, is what makes them work. So this is needed to be done, and it needs to be done probably more so when people are in isolation, because obviously it's people are totally distracted. They're living in different environments. When you're all in the one environment, for instance, in an office, whether it's university, wherever that it is, everybody's in the one environment, and so that breeds its own community, right? So there's less of a sense of community, obviously, when some people are working from their kitchens, some people from their studies and from their living rooms and wherever it is. And this feeling of inclusivity that's really vital in any organization, is lacking. It's lacking unless we have a very structured way of communicating with them on Zoom. So far from being zoomed out of it, I think that people, it's going to be a new reality anyway. So we might as well get used to it, because Zoom is going to be there. I mean, Zoom is now in the future. I mean, we've been using Zoom for the last probably year, but most people have never heard of Zoom the last month, right? So, but it is now a whole new way of communicating. But what leaders are going to say has been an important thing, because up to now, a lot of what has been said has been basically talking about the process of communication. Has been talking about the fact that we've moved into a new environment and we're going to communicate with you. I think it needs to get much more now back to business as usual. Right? Just so we get back to, we have our business meetings, we had them as we usually had them. There are different skills, I suppose, really, in terms of getting people at the beginning of their meetings from their own little environment into the environment of the community. And that's the skill of the, I suppose, the leader or the chairperson of the meeting to make sure that that happens. But I would think that you need to, obviously, we need to be doing communicating on a much more regular basis. We need to also be communicating on a one-to-one basis. I think we often think in this as being communicating, with groups.
Yeah.
I think that leaders need to communicate regularly on a one-to-one basis with people. And if they're not getting, for instance, if people aren't coming to them, they need to be going out, reaching out to people who may be shy about it, or who may be, not great with technology or whatever.
Yeah.
But people, the challenge is going to be over the next while that people don't get blasé about this, that they're not, and we will find that from now on there will be a whole different way of communicating, Zoom or WebEx or whatever that is going to be. That's going to have to be built into the whole communication strategy and policies of the way people want to communicate.
Communicate. Very good, very good. And just on that point of business as usual, or getting back to business as usual, Sean, it's clear we need to get back to business for the economy and society and so forth. And most people are keen to see restrictions being lifted. And at the same time, it needs to be done safely and not exposing our most vulnerable in society unnecessarily. So what thoughts would you have on that, the tension between these two priorities?
Ronan, I just refer back to Peter's comments on communication. I think that's when the communication will become very important, as particularly the Taoiseach and Taoiseach and others involved just communicate to the nation on the process in the weeks ahead. But you're right, it's a huge dynamic, and I think we're all very familiar with this. The reason we went into this lockdown was to try and protect our health system and make sure that there was enough critical infrastructure in place in intensive care units, and then to protect the most vulnerable. And certainly across Europe, it seems anyway, at the moment, that at this stage, that things have peaked in terms of virus morbidity and mortality, and a number of jurisdictions have started to reopen. And it's critical that we do as well quickly, because there's a big difference between being shut down for 2 months and being shut down for 3 months or 4 months. It isn't double the effect. It's magnifies it in terms of really the long-term consequences to so many small businesses and individuals and families.
Yeah.
And I think we've all read a lot lately and hear a lot about just the tension between protecting our healthcare system and the elderly versus protecting those who are younger and who've lost their jobs, and job losses have not been equal. Those who by and large are well educated and who have good internet and are in the professional classes have been able to work from home, and the younger groups in society who, whether they're working as waiters or in logistics or in transport or in entertainment or in leisure or tourism, are out of work and not able to work. So we think it's critical that we get a roadmap quickly to get back to work. And there's no certainty on how to do this. Nobody knows if there'll be a second phase or a third phase of this virus, but we just have to test it and find out. And I'll just come back to Peter's comments really on communication. I think that's going to be a critical time for that message to be delivered correctly.
Correctly, yeah. Very good, very good. Well, maybe coming back to you, Paul, on that of the 80 attendees on the webinar, I'm sure there's quite a few who have college-age students at home and are looking to return to the classrooms in the coming year. So how complicated is it to start up having thousands of students and staff back on campus if social distancing, for example, needs to be adhered to in a much more strict and elaborate way?
I mean, there are massive challenges around that, and there are still uncertainties around it. Will there be a second wave and a third wave of COVID-19? To what extent can we ease the social distancing challenges? We're in the throes, having just got the exam started. We've now begun to plan for all of that. The Leaving Cert is one of the big challenges at the moment, because there's an intention to hold it in August, but that isn't nailed down yet. We hope to have the results by October, And then we could probably start the first year students at the beginning of November and run a little bit later next year. And we're looking at plans around that. Then the question is, what do we do with the other years? Do we have them all start in November, or do we run staggered years, or do we start them a little bit later and maybe by semester 2 with the help of, for example, first years only doing course assessment, but not end of semester exams, but they would do a bit more assessment to make up for that, that you could integrate them in the second semester, but everything would finish a bit later. What are the knock-on effects then for medical graduates who are needed in the health service by July next year, if you do it a bit later? But also with the social distancing, I mean, with the best will in the world, I don't think anybody at this stage is expecting that we will be able to fill lecture theatres with 250, 300 students in September of this year. I think the likelihood is that there will not be an antidote to this virus by then. And therefore social distancing will be in place. So in all likelihood, a large amount of what we do will shift online come September.
Right.
We're going to try and nail down, and all of the university registrars are coordinating on this. We have an 8 a.m. meeting every Tuesday now since this started up to share our experiences and our thinking around planning around this. So if we move the large lectures online, then we may be able to have seminars, we may be able to have some element of presence on campus, but what does that mean for students and their need for accommodation? If, for example, it was only some days, but not other days, depending on what year of study. There really is an absolute wealth of stuff to be worked out around that. And we're in the early days with it, but we want to give some level of certainty, because I think one of the great killers in all of this is the uncertainty, and that goes back to the communication. But at the same time, you can only communicate what you can be confident about. And making promises that you might not end up being able to keep, I think would be worse. So you communicate, but you communicate in some cases that there is simply uncertainty. But there's no doubt that this changes the game for us in higher education. I mean, these are our youngsters, you know. Dare I say it, some in mid-career taking a few months out. It's not ideal, and I'm not going to try and downplay the extent or the impact of anyone losing their job. But youngsters at this stage in their career, they're looking at the possibility, well, is what's going to be on offer in the autumn really what I wanted? And would I be better waiting a year, at which point we may not have the capacity, or the grades might have to go up or whatever, or should I go with it anyway? There are big decisions for the youngsters to make, and the decisions we make will actually impact on the decisions that they make, or influence the decisions that they make.
And just on that, of the decisions that, the decisions that you're making, could you offer any insights there in terms of, let's say, for smaller organizations that wouldn't have the complexity and of challenges that you're faced with there in the university, but how you approach making decisions with so much uncertainty and so many knock-on effects for students and faculty? Do you have any, from so far, from the experience you've had, what's working well for you?
What's working well for us is identifying the stakeholders, engaging with them. And sometimes that's a larger group, sometimes it's a smaller group, depending on whether it's something that's university-wide or whether it's something that's very specific to one or two courses. So, you know, one of the issues for us, for example, this coming autumn, that relates to language students, not only language students, but primarily, is what's going to happen when if they can't go to France or Germany or Spain for the year. The level of consultation there is perhaps a little smaller than it would be around what are the semester dates going to be for the whole university. But the key thing is that we engage, we consult. And I'd say that no matter what size your organization is, you identify who the key stakeholders are, and you consult as widely as possible around the implications of anything that you're proposing.
Very good, very useful. Just to remind people again, there's a Q&A box on the screen if you want to pose questions to any of the panelists, or to all, and we'll come to those in a little while. Peter, just going back to you, that same point about returning to work, and clearly there will be anxiety about going back to workplaces, public spaces by employees, and the uncertainty maybe around even the need for, I don't know, monitoring, checking, health checks, privacy issues, and so forth. What would you recommend from managers in these circumstances to communicate well with those factors in the background?
Go back to what Paul was saying there, which is basically this: we're in unknown territory here. This hasn't been done before. There's no blueprint for doing this, and so really at this stage, when we know that there will be a return to work, there will be a return back, that people need to be turning their minds at this stage to planning that out and what it's likely to look like and what the phases are going to be. But the thing is that you need to create as much certainty as you can, even if there's certainty about the fact that you don't know something, and Paul alluded to that, but certainty about what we can say to you, certainty at a high level, and then bring it down as much as you can. In other words, we are going to be open. We're going to be opening in the 5th of September, right? We're going to open in 3 phases, throughout the month. We know that, right? Then as you go below that, you'll start to get a bit more granular. But then you're saying beyond that, here's what we'll be expecting you to do, A, B, and C. Now, you can only do so much of that today because we don't know what it's going to be like in September, right? Yeah. But in advance, if you're telling people, this is the plan that we have, this is the way that it's going to go. And indeed at that stage, to ask people, because there's no 2 or 3, 4 or 5 people in the center of an organization that knows how to do this, because as I said, it never happened before. So it's really worth widening out the consultation process to figure out in your area, what do you reckon you're going to need to do to comply with this, right? And what are we going, so everybody needs to know what everybody else is doing as well. So then, of course, there needs to be a very centralized management of this from the very top. But in doing that, it's communication. I would have thought every day. I would have special areas for communication. I would have stuff coming out over the internet. I would have stuff coming out, special communication processes and channels all of the time, just purely on making sure that everybody is bedding down at the same time. It's going to be a challenge. I don't have the answer to it, that's for sure. I take on a consultation on it if somebody wants.
I'm sure there'll be many of those.
Sorry, couldn't resist. But the thing is that you need to know where you're certain and bring it down if you start getting soft. When you start getting soft at that point, you need to have consult, talk, brainstorm, whatever it is, to make it as tangible as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Very good, very good. So Sean, just maybe come back to you on, as we, let's say, hopefully return to a new normal over the coming months and understand and get to grips with what that actually looks like as we repair the economy. We've spoken before about the whole area of slow food and slow finance movements and the attractiveness of sustainable growth in society, maybe moving away from relying on investing in businesses on the other side of the world. I suppose, do you see this slow movement perhaps gaining more traction now as a medium-term effect or knock-on effect of this health and economic shock?
Yeah, Ronan, that's a very interesting concept. And I think without a doubt, the move to locally sourced, whether it's produce from your local vegetable grower in your local market or your local bakery that's now going to deliver to you online, or other kind of artisan boutique shops, I think locally, or certainly throughout Ireland and throughout most regions, people have been relying on the local store and the local shop and the local butcher and the local baker. And I think the goodwill that's been generated by that is going to stay for a long, 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 long time. So most certainly, I think we'll see that. At a bigger level, for the larger companies, I think we'll see much more, certainly in the United States and in mainland Europe, manufacturing being brought back home, as they would call it. So it's highly likely you'll see an acceleration of old-fashioned manufacturing and supply chains leaving China and heading back to the United States or to Europe, where we're so dependent in Europe for, I think it's about 80 to 90% of some of the ingredients in antibiotics come from Asia, primarily
Wow.
China. So
My goodness.
for the very large companies, I think supply chains will definitely shorten, and that doesn't happen overnight. It's quite a long process. But for smaller artisan, whether it's your local photographer, we have, out of here in Dún Laoghaire, and our local photographer has been sending messages to the home saying you take a picture of families during COVID-19 and make a contribution to a local charity as well. And the local coffee roaster is delivering coffees, and as I mentioned, the local baker is delivering breads. So I think I see that accelerating, and I think it's a very good thing at a community level, and the spirit it'll engender.
Yeah, really being valued more for what it is, and maybe people willing to pay a little bit more for that extra value that they're getting.
I think so, and I think they get more than just the product. I think the sense of friendship, community, collectiveness, being together,
Yeah.
sense of pride in something being produced locally and being delivered locally and knowing where it's come from. So I think that'll just continue to accelerate. So,
Yeah.
and there are many benefits in that.
When you mentioned there about manufacturing perhaps returning to the United States, do you think that might impact us here as well with some of the...
Yeah, I think it's a risk longer term for some of the multinationals, for some of them, that certainly the current policy in the United States is to try and bring it all home. And but it takes a long time to do that, to get qualified staff and get production plants up and running. It doesn't happen overnight. So I think there's certainly a risk. And I think that's why, as a country going forward, we just need a greater emphasis on small businesses, small entrepreneurs, supporting them, encouraging them, buying from them. And I think we see that across Europe, that people are going back to supporting their neighbor.
Very good, very good. Well, that can't but be good. It's so, Paul, just going back to the points you were mentioning there about getting back on campus and maybe it being a different sort of environment. And are there any learnings you think you could share for, I suppose, with leaders about how they plan to return after the lockdown, post-lockdown world? You know, changes. You mentioned there, even you think that there's going to be a fairly fundamental change in the way education is being taught, a lot more online. Would you have any other thoughts that learnings you'd share there?
So I think more might go online, but I don't see that as a substitute for the student experience. So I think one of the challenges as normality comes back is, and I think it's already been said, not doing it too soon and in too much of a rush. I think we're going to have to listen to the best medical advice, because you can build things up only to find it all collapse the next day or the next week. And we need to be careful about that. But the other thing I think that anyone in a leadership position needs to be mindful of at the moment is that, much as this technology has helped us to keep a lot of shows on the road, it isn't actually a substitute for the human interaction. Long term, I don't see education. There are online universities. There are, things like the Open University, where a lot is done online, although even they combine that with one-day Saturday courses and so on, where people do actually meet each other. So I think one of the things for anybody in leadership at the moment is that whilst we're seeing new possibilities around the technology, I would be cautious about going too far with that.
Yeah.
Because I think that the human interaction, the human engagement, the face-to-face engagement, which will include international engagement. And I think Sean's points are well made about a lot of the local produce and so on. But if you look at a higher education setting, and if you look at some of the multinational companies that exist here, I think of the medtech industry, which is very strong here in Galway, we would want that still to be here. We would want to be still producing the graduates. We would still want to be attracting international students to be part of that, coming on to those kinds of degrees and so on. And so what I would say to anyone in a leadership role is, your eyes have probably been open to new possibilities that have been, necessity is the mother of invention, to use that old saying, in the last few months. But be careful that that actually where we were before still has an awful lot to contribute to where we will be in the future when we get back to some level of normality. And let's not pretend that this constant staring at screens is actually going to be a substitute for the way we build relationships, for the way that we build expertise, for the way that we actually develop leadership capacity.
Yeah, very good. And that leads me in really to a question for you, Peter, on this whole area of organizational culture. And obviously a lot of what a culture, how it's formed in an organization comes down to what is said and what's visible, behaviors that are there that you see and you learn from. Now, if we are having more of a virtual home working, online type relationship in companies, would you have any thoughts or advice on how to really sustain that culture, the organizational culture, where you can move beyond just communicating two-dimensionally across a conference call and have that greater visibility of behaviors?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because I mean, companies have spent a long time building up a culture, the way they do things. And the interesting thing about culture is that culture is a contagion. It's contagious. In other words, it spreads from person to person, and that's the whole nature of culture, in that there you have observed behaviors and people behave in a particular way because they see somebody else behaving in that way, and it's encouraged by the leadership and then through the whole organization. And so that is interrupted to some extent, definitely, by what's happening at the moment. There's no getting away from that, because the culture is not, this is not something that's terribly tangible. It's an intangible thing that happens when you walk into an organization. You can almost feel it, but it's in the way that things are done at meetings, the way that people actually interact with one another, the way they support one another, the way they collaborate with each other, the way that they include one another. So that the sort of areas of culture, whether that's innovation, whether it is collaboration, whether it is, customer focus, whatever all of that is, right, that needs to continue in the new reality, right? And continuing in the new reality, it is minus whether we like it or not. It's minus the handshake, minus, I don't know whether people hug in organizations or not, but it's minus all of those things, right? The tactility of it. And you mentioned two-dimensional there. That struck me recently, that we live in a three-dimensional world, right? I'm not a scientist, but maybe somebody could figure out, we're now living in a two-dimensional world to a large extent. We just see two dimensions of people, there's no depth. And what does that mean? I don't know what it means, but it has issues. But in terms of culture, I think that people probably at this stage need to break down, not from what instinctively is the culture, what actually is our culture, and seeing how that can be replicated in this more distant and remote way. So that's where you find, for instance, that people are, they're finding that they're looking out for people. So in other words, they are getting in touch with people, for instance, who are not getting in touch with them in the organization. That's when they find, for instance, they're doing big gestures. A client of mine recently sent 170 baskets of fruit out to all the clients, right? Which is nice. But you can't do that every week. You can if you like, but afterwards the gesture just doesn't become a gesture anymore. And you can do that for a while. But I think that what people need to be very conscious of is that how are we going through the interactions that we have, the limited interactions? Limited interactions are basically their meetings, right? They're meetings, they are town halls, if you can imagine, large town hall, that within all of those, that you do what you always have done. So in other words, it means you exaggerate. At the beginning of meetings, for instance, you'll find that it will be much more important for people to understand in the kind of forum that we're in at the moment, what are we doing and why are we doing it? And that the agenda comes way in advance so that we actually have a chance to prepare for it, so that our inputs are not, because they're not going to be as spontaneous as they would be around the table. Right? The chairperson, for instance, a chairperson's role in that situation would be to ensure that everybody is included, because they're all in different environments, as I said earlier. But the culture should be one of inclusion, that everybody gets involved.
Yeah.
So if the culture then is when we're looking at what it is important for the business, that they're actually still kept. So in other words, if we're looking at the results that are coming through, that there's no compromise in relation to the way that the results are reported, or in fact, no compromise in the way that the results are actually going to be treated and what remedies is going to be or whatever it's going to. So it needs to be that people start to feel, but that nothing has changed in terms of the way the organization treats them.
Right.
Right. But that happens naturally when you're in an organization, when you're in the building or in the organization. It happens naturally. It can't happen as naturally as that when you're remote. So you need to be very conscious of what it is that we do that makes our culture what it is, and replicate that as much as you can in the environment that we have at the moment. So it's a conscious thing. I think the culture, generally speaking, goes on unconsciously in organizations. Obviously, now needs to be a consciousness of what it is, and that consciousness needs to lead to certain actions and whatever across the environment that we have at the moment. That's the way I see it.
And do you think that's just the leaders in the organization, or does everybody in the organization change?
Cultures for everyone. I mean,
in leading that
culture happens. Okay, leaders are the people who are supposed to epitomize what that culture is, and they probably do it naturally, as I said, in the normal course of events, walking around saying hi to people on corridors, or in terms of the way they interact with managers and staff and everybody else, and the way things are done. But I think they need to be more conscious of doing that. That's at any leadership level, right? But the culture is how everybody does things, not just the leader. The leader leads that, but the culture is the way things are done. But from a leadership perspective, I think there needs to be an acute awareness that we had observed behaviors before. We can't observe behavior now because we can't see people anybody. Once they go off the screen, we don't know what they're doing. Right?
Don't know what they're doing. Yeah.
So I think that one of the big things that's coming out is that people will learn. They will learn from this that to trust people more, because they have to. I mean, people are being trusted at the moment, and things are happening, right? Yeah. And they will learn that I can trust people more. They will learn that people are much more resilient than maybe they thought they were. So there'll be lots of learnings from this. And in fact, when this is over, I think a really good exercise for everyone to do will be to stand back and say, well, what did we actually learn from this in terms of what were the positives we got from this? Because I think they're going to be huge.
Huge. Very good. Very good. Great. Well, I thanks, Peter, for that. I'll move to some of the questions that have been coming in. Michelle Vance poses a question of what do you think will need to be done to kickstart industry and retail when restrictions do start to ease? Because consumer sentiment will be presumably reduced due to fear, financial difficulty, which may impact on the speed that things recover. So is there anything, Sean, that you'd recommend maybe to kickstart industry and retail?
Gosh, that's a tricky one. And I suspect, unfortunately, when things open up initially, it'll probably be construction initially, and retail will probably be further down the line, just because of the spacing issues. But the biggest thing is getting money into people's pockets and people having confidence to spend that money. And I think if there's certainly certainty about how long payments will go for, whether they go for to the end of September, end of December, whatever the date is, just giving families confidence that they can actually go out and spend that money rather than hunkering down and saving. Because the big challenge is when you come out of this, none of us have been spending money really, other than perhaps on Netflix or downloading movies or whatever it is getting people back to spend that money and having the confidence to go into a store if somebody's coughing beside them. So I think it'll be driven by lots of things, by whether there's confidence around testing, a vaccine at one level, and secondly, really about just making sure taxes are low or that there's cash in people's pockets. Then that's where the government has to spend and support industries, certainly over an extended period ahead.
Very good. Very good. Well, on that, Philip Clark added in a question here about the fact that many high street names are in trouble and some have already called in receivers. I think Debenhams was one of them. I'm wondering, does that mark the beginning of a change?
I think
Amazon, for example, people are spending on Amazon, so it's...
I think it accelerates a huge change, and it's the same for large commercial offices. So many of us who were chatting earlier And I think, Peter, you alluded to it there about trusting people and that work was getting done and people were working remotely. So
Yeah.
whenever this ends or whatever the new normal is, I think a lot of people realize that they don't need to have long commutes every day of the week and that they can work remotely. And so many firms will realize that they don't need perhaps the same amount of office space,
Yeah.
whether that's offices or retail. This kind of trend to acquiring things online and having efficient deliveries, it's probably going to continue and accelerate from here.
All right. In that respect, Paul, do you see kind of competition now coming from other universities who, a student in Ireland might think, well, why not do a degree online in the US or in some other university in the UK? And if I'm going to be doing more online with my university here in Ireland?
Possibly. I think all the universities are going to react by looking again at what can be delivered online and what can't. But do I see a massive shift amongst 18-year-olds towards the notion that really I'll do the degree online and continue to work in my part-time job in Offaly or West Cork or Donegal or whatever?
Yeah.
Unlikely. One never knows, but I think it's unlikely because remember, I suppose in the university, we take kids who have grown up in a certain environment and they're now breaking out into something more, which is part of their formation as adults, as people.
Yeah.
And that involves a wider engagement when you're going for a degree than simply living in your own local community. And very often it means going out for a few years and getting that experience and whatever and bringing it back to your own community. Some people do go back to their own communities, but they need those few years out. And I don't think that'll be provided if they simply decide to opt for an online degree. And I'm not sure that the kind of 18-year-old who's going to university would necessarily want that. Now, some may be driven to that by economic circumstance. They will look for that. But I don't see it as creating a massive change in the behavior of students. What I do see is it creating some level of change and probably some significant level of change in the way we go about our business in the university. There is no doubt that all the universities will explore greater opportunities for online delivery, but that's likely to be simply a larger part of what we call blended delivery, so a mixture of online and physical presence. There are certain degrees you have to be able to do lab experiments. You're not going to be able to set up a lab in your home in the countryside, or if you do, it might explode on you.
Yeah.
So I think that there certainly will be changes in the way the universities do. We will learn from this. We will try and take some of the benefit of this forward and feed that into the student experience. But there will still be a demand for us to produce graduates, not just for industry. Talking about repatriating industry to the US, you look at the medtech industry, and I mentioned it earlier, here in the West. And one of the attractions for that medtech industry, whether it's in the West or in other parts of Ireland, is the flow of graduates coming through who are in this space that they can tap into. That demand will remain, and those jobs won't necessarily get farmed out to all the different little rural areas. There'll still be centres where that is required. But look, the universities in the Irish system have always been in a space of, shall we say, collaborative competition. So we have a large degree of mutual interest, but we're in competition with each other for recruiting the students, and that's not going to change. I think those who adapt the fastest and the best to what the students themselves want will be the ones who will gain from this.
Very good. Well, thank you. Thank you. This has been a very interesting discussion, and it's almost time to finish. We're getting close to the end. As you know, in Timony, our purpose is summarized with the line, better people, better organizations, better society. So if I could finish by maybe asking each of you a broader question related to society. Last week, you might have seen it, David Thunder, a lecturer in the University of Navarra's Institute for Culture and Society in Pamplona in Spain, was writing in the Irish Times, and he raised the question, and maybe indeed the hope, that he said, whether this crisis will shift us to a greater appreciation of our mutual dependency and perhaps shake us out of an individualist slumber and hyper-consumer society that has characterized Western economies in recent times. So maybe, Paul, could I start with you? What would your thoughts be on that?
I hope it does. If I was to say one thing, and I'll try and keep it brief, but going back to when I was still in the north, which was until 6 years ago, and I used to, on a long drive to work every morning, frequently listen to RTE radio morning show. And after the 2008 crash, it became the daily economic news, and I started looking for greater variety on other channels. And I think a lot of our thinking since the 2008 crash has been around the notion that we are first and foremost an economy. And I think if this gives us a bit of a shake and makes us realize that actually we need to think about what we are as a society in terms of which the economy is one part, but only one part, then I think that would be very welcome. I think it has been sorely needed for a lot of years now here in the Republic.
Very good. And Sean, would you have thoughts on that?
I would. It reminds me of the old Irish proverb, "Er scoa a chéile a warren na nina," and it's kind of going back that really we're all dependent on each other. And I think if certainly chatting to friends and clients and family across Ireland, it seems every community is having a local online quiz or a get together, and people are dropping food into neighbors. And so I think there's been some tremendous benefits that'll continue hopefully for the years ahead. And I'm very confident that'll be the case, that the sense of community and what's important really we've been reminded by that. And just to touch on it as well, just the interest in the humanities and arts and watching plays and ballet and opera, things that are being streamed online for free. That's really what's kept people, I think, sane in this time as well. So I think a big shift, hopefully, that'll continue.
Very good. And Peter, maybe the final word to you.
Yeah, I wouldn't be so confident. I think that we've come through a number of phases. I think that we were very reliant on each other, and we had a great sense of community in this country. And then when we got the Celtic Tiger, we all got rich to way above ourselves at that stage, and it became very individualistic. And that path was not going to stop until the crash came. When the crash came, then we went back to community because it was a kind of a default position, and we felt that we needed each other to support. And if you watch from that up to the beginning of this, we were actually reverting again. So there's a kind of a correlation between how well off people are and how individualistic that they are. And maybe that's a very simplistic way of looking at it. But I think, okay, this has given us a major shock. And there's no question about it, even on a wider scale. Because, this feeling that science is infallible and that we are, as a species, that we are, indefeatable, and that basically we dominate everything. And you get this small little thing, you can't even see it, comes along and knocks us all flat and brings us back to where we were. And it is bringing out the best, and there's no question about that. It's bringing out this thing of we are dependent on each other, and we are all doing this. It's happening all over the world. It's not just here, but it's happening in Ireland again, particularly. We're doing it terrifically well. Now, whether that's sustainable or not, whether it's enough of a shock for it to be sustainable, I think we all know now. We felt it, that we actually do need this. I'm not quite sure. I hope, like everybody, I hope that we do, because it's beginning to give us the understanding that there's a huge bit more of a dimension to life than what it is that you own and what you can show off. And how you can that people's lives are consumed with somehow or other being better than the person that's next to them. What does better mean? Better means I've got more things, got shinier things, I've got, I can show I've got more wealth. And like to some extent, that was dominating our lives. I think that's when Paul was putting it that way as well, and as was Sean. So I think that we've got the shock, we've seen it. Now, how sustainable that's going to be, I don't know. But I go back to Sean's point, which I think is hugely significant. It's very, very interesting to see that as soon as this happened, the sort of response that came from the arts community and the sort of kind of reliance that people had to go back to art. I mean, art meaning not just necessarily high art, art in every one of its forms, whether it's music, whether it's theater, or whatever it was going to be. And that's where people went to get their solace. It's where people went to in order to give themselves a different meaning and a different feeling to what was going on. And I just hope that government realizes at this stage the importance of the arts in society, and not and that should be reflected not just to realize it, but to reflect it in the sort of funding that the arts is going to get from here on in. It's had a huge, and it's only when people found that they needed a refuge to go to that they found the arts was supplying that, and the arts community, in fairness, rose to the challenge. And if you look out there on all the various different websites, there's an enormous amount of art from Irish artists and international ones, Irish ones particularly, out there, and they've broadcast daily and hourly, in order to, I suppose, to look at, to boost the morale, as it were, of the whole populace here in Ireland. So I just hope to God that doesn't get forgotten as well.
That gets
so I think we've got a
recognised.
sharp, and I'll wait and see. I'm not confident that either of those two things are going to happen.
Well, we've been given the opportunity, you could say, at least to take it. Whether we do or not remains very much in our hands. And indeed, just to echo your point about the arts, and people have known that people have got a lot of solace as well from other sources too, in terms of even just apparently the record numbers accessing webcams in churches and things like that.
Yes.
Just so multiple areas where people can dip in and get help. Well, look, thank you very much to my guests, Professor Paul O'Doherty, Registrar and Deputy President of NUI Galway, Sean O'Flanagan, Board Director and Chief Investment Officer of Kinsale Capital, and Peter Finnegan, Managing Director of Communique International. It's been very insightful and interesting. Enjoyed it. I hope you did too. Thank you also to our 80 attendees who've joined us over the past hour. We'll be back again next week with another webinar and with alumni guests from Timony. If you would like to hear a bit more about the economic perspective, I'd recommend you check out a recording on the IESE website, that's IESE, where they have their economist Nuria Mas gave a session last week that was very interesting and insightful as well. We'll follow up this session as usual with asking for your feedback. We greatly appreciate it, and indeed it guided the questions that we posed to our panelists today. So thank you very much again, and thank you to our panelists, and stay safe for the week ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.